I'm not going to start today's episode with my own words as I usually do. Today I will begin with some of the words from Julia Gillard, a previous Prime Minister of Australia, delivered in her national apology for forced adoptions on the 21st of March 2013. This apology is extended in good faith and deep humility. It will be a profound act of moral insight by a nation searching its conscience. It will stand in the name of all Australians as a sign of our willingness to right old wrongs and face hard truths. As Australians, we are used to celebrating past glories and triumphs, and so we should. We are a great nation. But we must also be a good nation. Therefore, we must face the negative features of our past without hesitation or reserve. That is why the period since 2008 has been so distinctive, because it has been a moment of healing and accountability in the life of our nation. For our country, just for as a person, it takes a lot of courage to say we are sorry. We don't like to admit when we are mistaken or misguided. Yet this is part of the process of a nation growing up. Holding the mirror to ourselves and to our past and not flinching from what we see. What we see in that mirror is deeply shameful and distressing. A story of suffering and unbearable loss. But ultimately a story of strength as those affected by forced adoptions found their voice, organised and shared their experiences. And by speaking truth to power, brought about the apology that we offer today. This story had its beginnings in a wrongful belief that women could be separated from their babies and it would be all for the best. Instead, these churches and charities, families, medical staff, and bureaucrats struck at the most primal and sacred bond there is, the bond between a mother and her baby. Those affected by forced adoption came from all walks of life, from the city or the country, people who were born here or migrated here, and people who are Indigenous Australians, from different faiths and social classes. For the most part, the women who lost their babies were young and vulnerable. They were often pressurised and sometimes even drugged. They faced so many voices telling them to surrender, even though their own lonely voice shouted from the depths of their being to hold on to the new life that they had just created. Too often they did not see their baby's face. They could not soothe his first cries, never felt the warmth or smelt her skin. They could not give their own baby a name. Those babies grew up with other names and in other homes, creating a sense of abandonment and loss that sometimes could never be made whole. This apology did not undo the wrong that was done. I can only hope that in some small way, for those affected, the acknowledgement that occurred helped them to feel seen. The team at If These Trees Could Talk wish to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Wanneroo Nation. We would like to recognise that we share our stories from the stolen lands of our nation's first storytellers. Our conversations in many ways follow their traditions of storytelling and sharing knowledge and experience. We wish to pay our respect to the Wanneroo elders and ancestors, as well as extend that respect to all First Nations people, including our listeners, and acknowledge and honour their continued connections to the land and waters that have been the inspiration for the stories that we share.
We acknowledge all of the lands that this podcast is reaching, in particular the Tongarung land on which today's story takes place.
We're talking about a level of abuse that is so severe that it could cause a child's brain not to produce the hormones required for them to grow properly. Some of them are conditioned to believe. Some of them knew what was going on there and they hid it. And they're just as much at fault as what Anne-Hamilton Byrne is. She was just stealing children. This isn't just a case of popping a few kids in a house and a couple of people taking care of them. This is systemic, planned abuse. This is part 2 to our conversation about the cult called The Family. If you haven't listened to part 1, where we talk about Anne-Hamilton Byrne and how she found her feet in the space of becoming a spiritual guru to around 500 people, starting in the 60s in Victoria, I suggest you pop back and have a little listen to that one first, as it provides some context into what we're going to discuss today. Just in case you're going to dive straight in, I'm going to pass on the same trigger warnings that I provided last week. This episode is one that you probably won't want to listen to with little ears around. So if you're in the car or around the house with kids, I'll give you just a second to switch off or press pause to pop in some headphones. The following conversation explores issues around drug use, illegal adoption, the severe emotional neglect, mistreatment and abuse of young children, the mistreatment and exploitation of individuals with mental health conditions, suicide and injustice within the legal system. Now, before I start, I want to explain to you a choice that I've made. It feels a bit wishy-washy, but there's a really specific reason about why I've made it. As we go through today's conversation in relation to the children that were brought in and raised as part of the family, I've chosen not to share their names. It's not because that there's not plenty of information out there in relation to specific treatment of certain individuals within the family. I just have a really firm belief that the victims of crime, especially when it comes to child abuse, are keepers of their own stories. And when it comes to sharing particular aspects of their personal journeys, I believe that information has the most impact when it comes directly from the survivor. So while today we're going to talk about what life was like for these children within the cult, I've refrained from attributing any specific instances to any specific people. There are fantastic resources out there, which, like always, we will link in the show notes. Some of them come directly from the individuals themselves that have lived through these experiences, and others have come from people who have worked closely with the survivors. And out of respect for their own journeys forward into adulthood, I feel I can comfortably and respectfully provide an overview of what life was like and some of the brutality that occurred, but ultimately their personal stories are their own to share.
That's fair.
There are so many things that are happening simultaneously throughout the period of time that the cult was at its height. So for people to get a clearer picture, I've kind of broken it up, and I've told you first of all about Anne and how she kind of got to where she got and the people that were involved. Today we're going to bring in the kids that some were born into the cult, some were brought from families that already existed within the cult and then moved over to the house at Eildon. All of this happened between the mid-60s right up until the time that the police intervened and raided the house on Lake Eildon.
When was that?
It was August 16th, 1987.
Long time.
A long time.
Over 20 years.
While all this plays out, there are already kids that have parents in the cult. They're being raised by their parents, and then Anne-Hamilton Byrne goes to those parents and says, your child is part of this bigger plan. And some of them stay with the parents, some of them move to other sect members, some of them are taken over to the house at Eildon. All of this happens all together, but it's very difficult to tell the story with it all weaved in together. So this is why I've split it up into the two sections to try and help you get your head around what was going on. So I left you last week with that quote from Raynor before I talked about Anne and her maternity gear. I can't be certain if this was her plan all along or if she became like a self-fulfilling prophecy, like if this started and just as a yoga teacher and, then Raynor become part of it. We don't know exactly whether he was manipulating her or if she was just manipulating him. But they both seemed to have a firm knowledge the whole way through of what was going on. So I feel like he played a really significant part in this. So I'm not really confident in just saying this was all Anne and it fell down from there. I have a feeling that it was a bit of a two-way street with these two people. And when I say that, I'm not implying that Raynor was part of the abuse cycle that occurred, because there is no reports in that. Whether he knew what was going on or not, that's not clear either. What is clear is that they took a group of children and provided them with an exceptionally damaging period of time in the formative years of their lives. All of this early stuff in relation to the meditation and the yoga and all of that kind of stuff kind of happened over in the Dandenong Ranges, which is a little bit away from Lake Eildon. The Lake Eildon property was purchased and set up specifically to house the children that Anne believed were gifts to her, and she was creating what she believed were the people who were going to carry on her legacy. Well, that's what she peddled to the cult members. It's very hard to know if she believed what she was selling.
Yeah, what I wouldn't give to have an honest conversation with this person.
People tried to have honest conversations with her, some of the children included, and you can see footage of that in 60 Minutes interviews, and there's some stuff on Current Affair. She never once acknowledged what she did. And she had plenty of opportunity to do that.
So when she was approached, she was saying that she was doing the right thing?
It was all about this. When I mentioned before about her self-fulfilling prophecy, whether this just kind of happened, whether she had this plan the whole time, I wonder if, like, her own childhood needs, we talked a little bit about that in part one, and the lack of a structured family. Her mum spent a real significant period of time institutionalised. And I think when she was home, she was quite erratic. And for Anne and who she became, so the cult originally was called the Great White Brotherhood, and then it changed to the family. So that gives you a little bit of an indication about what she was trying to create. And I think as her notoriety grew and she started to become a prophet as the people saw her and how she saw herself, I think there's a big part of this where it was about fulfilling all of the things that she had missed out on in her own childhood, and having these picture perfect children became part of her desire of what she wanted to put out into the world. She definitely didn't want to be a parent because she didn't raise these kids.
I don't know what you're about to talk about, but I can tell from the warnings that you've given us that it's not good. So maybe just to go back to what you spoke about in part one, you've given her a lot of grace.
More than she deserves. Far more than she deserves.
Right.
But you can't look at vulnerable people and how they can get pulled into something like this without looking at why somebody's out there maliciously damaging other people's lives.
All right, let us know what you did.
Apart from the house in the Dandenongs, and they had like a little hall where they had their meetings, she had the property at Lake Eildon as well. She also had purchased, by this time, a property in the Catskills near New York, and she also had a property in London as well. So she was travelling back and forwards between these places a lot. Anne had employed somebody to make her maternity smocks, but she did not carry any of the children, and there were up to 28 at differing times. Some were housed with people in the cult, some were with the aunties, and I'll explain more about them in just a second, in the house in Eildon. Some of them went on trips with her overseas and then would be with other sect members. Her tentacles were far-reaching. It wasn't just people here in Australia. She also had followers in England, and all of these people were puzzle pieces in this giant web that she was weaving. I mentioned a little bit in part one as well about her power over the sect members, and Anne really had this tendency to blow up people's lives. I'm just going to say it as it is. She might decide that a particular person being married to somebody else didn't serve her and she needed to manipulate these relationships. Once those people had gone through their clearing and had pledged their allegiance to her, part of that was that they would obey everything that she said. Everything was just about getting what she needed. If you were super compliant and you had your first little bit of LSD and you handed your sin over and you said she was Jesus, things were really, really simple for you. But if it took you a little bit more time to come round, that's when things got a little bit harder. So during this time where she was doing these clearings and absorbing all of the sin of the people who were choosing to follow her, she was suggesting that marriages should end and that different sect members should date somebody else. And all of this was for her own orchestration to be able to make this nice little tight-knit group in the middle of the sect who were more aware of what was actually going on. And this is where the aunties came in. The children, when they came to Eildon, were not in Anne and Bill's care. They were in the care of aunties who were sect members, a lot of them nurses, and they would spend 2 weeks at a time at the property with the children. The other 2 weeks they would go to work, so they had an income to be able to provide food and school supplies and the necessities for those kids. I'm going to talk a little bit about how these children were acquired. Some were taken from sect members, placed with other families. Some were brought into the home at Eildon. Others were acquired by illegal adoption. Now, if we look at the 60s and 70s in Australia, it wasn't a nice place to be a woman who was unmarried and finding herself pregnant. It was very shameful. Illegitimate children were not given the best lives. There was no welfare in place to help people to take care of kids. Women who were vulnerable and found themselves pregnant and without family support often put their children up for adoption. Abortion was still illegal at this stage in Australia. So there really was no option. If you did not have family support that would allow you to keep your child, there was illegal abortions available, but that put you at significant risk. And they were hard to come by as well. These women would often be sent away. There were maternity homes, but your mum and dad wouldn't say, oh, little Sally's just ducked up to the maternity home for the next 7 months until she gives birth to a child. They'd come up with some great story about you studying somewhere, or you'd gone to stay with friends, or you'd got a new job. And then you would return home after you had had your baby. Your baby had been placed with somebody else and you went on with your life and likely probably never talked about it ever again. It was incredibly traumatic for these mothers and then children who went on to live lives, and not all of them were bad. Some of them were probably adopted by really lovely families who took care of them. But this left a wide open hole for Anne-Hamilton Byrne, who was putting together a little army of picture-perfect soldiers to carry on her legacy and take over the world once the aliens arrived. She had doctors and nurses and social workers, as well as judges and lawyers. Every aspect of this was taken care of by sect members. When she decided it was time to bring a new child in, a child would be born in a hospital by a sect doctor. It would be handed to a sect nurse. The paperwork would be prepared by a sect solicitor or a sect lawyer, handed to a sect social worker, and then Anne would put in a call to one of the members and say, your child has arrived, go to this hospital at this time and collect it. And that person would duck off feeling like they'd been gifted something amazing, collect their child, bring it back, and then Anne would take that child and it would be raised by the aunties in Eildon. This didn't just occur in normal hospitals. It also occurred in New Haven. There were patients in there who had children that they couldn't look after. There were women in there who were pregnant that were suffering psychiatric illnesses. And Anne was doing a very good job in that space of collecting new followers and promising things to people who were exceptionally vulnerable. If she's promising, we can take care of your child, I have a lovely family who wants to look after them, and they are in a mental institution, not coping, may not have family support on the outside, it was like ducking into a fruit stall for her. You just popped in and grabbed what you wanted. And it fit in perfectly because she would just have her maternity smock and pop on a pillow, and that pillow would get bigger over the next few months, and she would turn up with a little baby. As these children were brought in, they were introduced as siblings to the children that she already had, or they could be classed as fosters and they might live with a sect family. But this hierarchy, even between the children that she was creating, you could come in as a sibling and be in that home for a period of time and then be demoted and sent off to live with a sect family. She acquired 3 children at one point and brought them in and just told everybody that she'd had triplets. There is no way that she gave birth to any of these children herself, but she had the paperwork, she had the doctor's signatures, she had the social work signatures. She was just stealing children.
Give me some imagery. Like you've got a family over, like where are all these sect members? They're just in their house living like they usually would?
So some of them live around Lake Eildon. Some of them live in the Dandenong Ranges. They're all part of this big group.
But they're just living in homes like
their own suburban lifestyles. So from the outside, it looks all totally perfect.
Except when a child turns up that...
But it's super easily explained because they're a family. So this child has gone off to live with their auntie at Lake Eildon. Mm-hmm. It feels incredibly chaotic to try and explain it to you, and I can see the look on your face and you're kind of like, oh, this is a lot. And it is a lot. A lot was going on at that time. This was over a period, say, from the mid-60s to late 70s, possibly early 80s, where these children were coming in and out of this house at Eildon. There wasn't 28 kids there all at once. Mm-hmm. There could have been close at times. It was incredibly chaotic.
Were they always babies?
No, I don't think so. I think when they come from the sect members, that those children might have been living in a normal family structure for quite a period of time.
Yeah, you said that, sorry.
I did mention in last week's episode the lady that just really wanted to have a mum, and that's how she got drawn into the cult. She had 2 children herself, and when she was pregnant with her second child, Anne got the other sect members to cut her out, not talk to her, leave her out of things that she normally would have been included in. And she was incredibly depressed during that time. Her mental health suffered. And so Anne came to her caringly, lovingly, and said, "You're not doing so well. how about you come to my property in England and do some work on yourself, and I'll take both of your babies and we will take care of them for you while you sort yourself out. And she agreed to that. Her level of manipulation over these people is so severe and so strong, she could make them agree to just about anything. This woman who agreed to let Anne take her children, and if you watch the documentary, you'll know straight away who I'm talking about. Her life was never the same and her kids suffered. When her kids were returned to her, one of them was completely nonverbal because of the abuse that he had suffered. Her other child, who was a little bit older, attempted suicide at 16. He was unsuccessful, but he was successful when he was 20 years old. She gave her life and her dedication to this woman who manipulated her, took her children, destroyed their lives as well, and when those children didn't serve her anymore, she just handed them back to a lady who had no idea what was occurring to them or how to pick up the pieces. This isn't just a case of popping a few kids in a house and a couple of people taking care of them. This is systemic, planned abuse. I really feel like, and this is my own personal opinion, this hasn't come from anyone else, Anne was just trying to paint a picture. Those children, many of them had their hair dyed on a monthly basis, so they were blonde, just like her. And if you know anything about this cult, you will have seen the photos that I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yep.
The girls are in little smock dresses with lace collars, and the boys have got skivvies and jeans, and they're all dressed the same. It's this picture perfect thing. Anne had photographers and people filming them. So they would come for picnics maybe on a weekend when they were around in Australia and spend time, and they so lovely, so wonderful, and the kids were so excited to see them. But the kids were excited because for the rest of the week they were being flogged half to death by this group of women who did not want to parent these children but were doing it because they were ordered to do it. So before we go into the complexity of that, I'll give you a little picture of what life looked like on a typical day in the house at Eildon. So the house itself is like a 2-story kind of cottagey looking, you would expect it to be like a holiday home type house. It was surrounded by trees. People from the outside couldn't see in easily. The house itself, and all of the kids describe it this way, was exceptionally dark. The girls shared a room. The boys shared a room. There was obviously a kitchen where meals were prepared. There was a little outdoor area where they had some play equipment, and the kids were allowed to go outside for short periods of time each day to have some running around, which would help them burn up energy. Although how any of them had energy is miraculous when we look at what happens further on. So a standard day would look like getting up early. If you were somebody who couldn't make it through the night without going to the toilet, because you certainly were not allowed to get up after it was your bedtime. So if you had woken up to a wet bed, or you were the child next to the child who had wet their bed, beatings would occur because you had not been able to hold on through the whole night. And that was just a tiny little part of the things that they would be disciplined for. But then what would follow would be getting ready for the day. They would do yoga. They would do meditation. They would have breakfast. Then there would be schoolwork. They'd have a short period for lunchtime. I think they had a recess time too. They were the only times that they were permitted to use the bathroom. They could not put their hand up like our children can in class and say, "Excuse me, miss, may I use the bathroom?" That would be immediate discipline. And when we're talking about discipline, I'm not talking about a smack on the hand. We're talking about corporal style punishment. Canes, floggings, it could be the heel of a shoe. It could be whatever they could get their hands on that they would use to discipline these kids. So after school, they would have dinner, more meditation before they went to bed, and once it was your bedtime, you got into bed and you did not get up again until the next morning. It was very regimented, their life. They knew exactly what they needed to do and what was expected of them. But like all children, you might step out of line. You might need to go to the toilet. You might say something that you shouldn't. And the results of stepping outside of those lines were catastrophic. The types of punishment, I mentioned some of the beatings that occurred. They also used waterboarding, which is a type of punishment that they use at Guantanamo Bay, where you take somebody and hold their head underwater for maybe 10 or 15 seconds and then pull their head out. And then if they don't give you the answer that you want, your head is then plunged back into that bucket. This is something that occurred at the home in Lake Eldon. It was often used as a method to get children to own up to something. Say if something had gone missing or somebody had taken a little bit of extra food. If somebody didn't immediately own up, the kids were punished as a whole. I really want to delve further into explaining this to you, but I've made that commitment that those stories should belong to the people who experienced it. It's hard. It is hard to listen to them talk about this. But it is so worth it because who they have become on the other side is so commendable and their resilience is just extraordinary. Before I go into this next bit, I'll tell you a little bit more about the aunties. Some of the aunties actually turned out to be the biological parents of the children who were held at the house at Lake Eldon. I can't imagine how that felt for them when the time came that they found out that these people who were dishing out their daily abuse were actually their biological parents. The food that they received was they had a completely vegetarian diet. It would be fruit for morning tea. I would say the same thing for breakfast. They would be given vegetables for lunch. The food quality was substandard. A lot of times they were eating rotten fruit. They were fed very small amounts, enough to keep them alive, but often the purchasing of the food was left to the aunties with the money that they raised from their jobs on the weeks where they weren't required to be administering the discipline and teaching and being there. I'm not going to say taking care of them, but being there supervising what was going on in the house. There were kids in this group that were so malnourished that they started to form, the little potbelly thing that you see in the World Vision videos and stuff. Those children will be berated and then have their meals taken off them completely because they were putting on weight. I did hear a little story about Anne when she attended a primary school. The kids were a little bit cruel to her about her own weight, and I think she had a very strong sense of how she wanted her family members to look and be presented to the outside world. So being overweight was just not an option. But starving a child who is developing a stomach because they're malnourished is not the way to fix that. There were also children there who had specific mental conditions, one who had epilepsy, one who had asthma. One of the kids actually, their brain, because of the abuse and the life that they were living, had stopped producing a growth hormone. So she'd stopped growing completely. So included in their very, very poor and quantity deprived diet, they would be given a concoction of vitamins and minerals that they would take as supplements. As a form of punishment, food could be taken away from them. So with that poor nutrition and the concoction of artificial nutrients that they were giving them, the little girl who wasn't growing was also given some, I think they were imported from Germany, and it was like a growth hormone, but it was taken from animal parts and stuff. It wasn't, you didn't duck down to the chemist and buy what they were injecting this little girl with. When she was rescued, she grew 11 centimetres in 12 months. We're talking about a level of abuse that is so severe that it could cause a child's brain not to produce the hormones required for them to grow properly. So in amongst those vitamins, there was also very often doses of a whole pile of drugs. Mostly, I think, to keep the kids obedient and not rowdy. And I'm going to read you a list of what these drugs are. You might know some of them. Anatensol was a popular one, and it's commonly used for the treatment of decreased mental function due to a medical disease, agitation, or delusions. It has some side effects such as decreased heart rate, amenorrhea in women, constipation, and blurred distance vision. Amenorrhea is where your reproductive system just shuts down. You don't have a period, you don't ovulate. And this is a very common side effect, and they're giving this to children. Seropax, which is used to treat anxiety and also acute alcohol withdrawal. This medication belongs to a class of drugs called benzodiazepines. Benzos, as they're commonly called, and most people would know it as that, are antidepressant drugs which slowly turn down the messages between the brain and the body. Benzos include a group of nervous system depressants prescribed as a short-term treatment. And I'm put a bit of emphasis on that. A short-term treatment for stress, anxiety, or insomnia.
They're highly addictive.
Yes, very addictive, and they're just tranquilizers. Valium was also included in this. It's pretty safe to say we probably all know what that is. It's part of the same benzo family, and it's used to treat a range of conditions including anxiety, seizures, alcohol withdrawal, muscle spasms, insomnia, and restless leg syndrome. If I have a Valium, I can be asleep and not functioning, and I'm an adult, a large adult. Imagine giving a dose of that to a small child, along with some of this other stuff. There was another one called Mogadon. It's also part of the benzo family, and it's a hypnotic drug. It's used, again, for short-term relief of severe disabling anxiety. So when people are really, really not okay, this is a drug that doctors will prescribe. It's also used for insomnia. It has sedative properties and can be used as an anticonvulsant and a muscle relaxant. Common side effects include drowsiness, dizziness, tiredness, confusion, unsteadiness when walking, memory impairment, headache, hangover. When it says hangover, it's like a feeling. You know that if you've had something and you wake up in the morning and you can still feel the effects of that drug, it's that same, it makes that occur. It can also induce slurred speech. It sounds like I've had one. Slurred speech, clumsiness, numbed emotions, double vision, inattention, unpleasant dreams, and rebound insomnia. Lamictal was another favourite, which is also known as lamotrigine, and it's a medication used to treat epilepsy and stabilise mood disorders. Side effects include confusion, drowsiness, fever, chills, headache, nausea, vomiting, rashes, and sensitivity to lights. And there was also another one called selzlazine, I think, which is an antipsychotic that's used to treat schizophrenia and people with generalised anxiety disorders. But medically, it is a less preferred treatment for these things. They generally use benzos to treat that type of stuff. So I don't know if it was the same at this time in the 60s, but it was something that was readily available and often given to the kids.
How did they know? How did they find out about these drugs?
We'll find out a little bit later that the kids were eventually rescued. And it was one of the children who actually later became a doctor who provided a lot of this information to the authorities. And she has also written a book. Amongst these drugs, children were also subjected to clearings, the same as the adults were. So once they were of age, and of age, we're talking about somewhere between 14 and 16. I think it did occur with some kids earlier than 14, maybe around 12, depending on when it was time for them to be initiated into the cult. So the same clearing ritual would be done on the children as was the adults, where they were given doses of LSD, psilocybin, often injected, not just on a little piece of paper that you chew up so it comes on slowly, injected into their veins by a needle. This could be done at the home. It could be done at the meditation centre. It could also be done in New Haven. I think some of them occurred while the kids were overseas at their London home as well. And the results for this, for children being given adult doses of hallucinogenics, was, I just can't wrap my mind around not just an adult choosing to do this, but a group of people sitting by and allowing it to happen. So these kids would be often starved prior, and then just before the clearing, they'd have a bath and a piece of toast, and they'd be taken into a dark room. The LSD would be injected, and they would be left to trip. Anne would often sit in with them and talk to them about confessions that needed to be made. Had they been sexually abused? Did they have sexual thoughts? That part of it is just the tip of the iceberg to what these kids experienced under LSD. And without going into specific incidences for specific people, I'm going to say it ranged from being questioned about things that you may have felt were sinful, right through to being berated and told that you were a slut and you were a prostitute and you wanted to be raped, and threatening to put a knife into your insides and pull out your reproductive organs so you didn't keep wishing that a man would rape you. There is a specific instance, and we have to remember that these people are under hallucinogenics. There is a specific instance where someone now carries a scar where they believe that there was a medical procedure performed on them while they were under the effects of LSD. There is also another report of physical injury that occurred that could be explained by sexual assault. We really have no clear idea of what occurred to these children under the effects of these drugs. They weren't just physically and emotionally manipulated. Their brains were pushed to the absolute extreme. It's just a miracle that any of them survived to be able to share their stories.
Did they all survive?
As far as we know, there was a missing persons report issued at one point, and police did go into the house at Eildon looking for a person. They didn't find them there. I don't know what happened to that person. There's also reports of the children being taken to what I assume is like a chiropractor, and they were administered anesthetic. So they would be completely asleep, and then their bodies would be manipulated. And it was about aligning their spines, apparently. But one person talks about looking in and seeing the person who they believed was their sister actually bent over backwards in a C shape. That doctor who was performing these body manipulations ended up fleeing because he killed a child. I don't know if that was a child within the cult or whether it was somebody else who was taking their child to this man. That's without the people who didn't make it through, who couldn't recover from the trauma and then ended their own lives. So as these kids are growing up, they're obviously bonding and forming relationships with each other like siblings would. It is odd that your sibling could then be demoted and become a cousin, but these kids knew no different. They didn't spend time in the outside world. They weren't spending time in other families. They weren't going to school. They didn't get a picture of what reality outside of this completely conditioned environment that they lived in looked like. It was only when some of the older girls were old enough to work and were permitted to go out and work that some things started forming in their brains where they were like, I don't know if we're like everybody else. I don't think this is what a normal family looks like. It was some of those girls, along with some others who had left, so 2 girls in particular, who played absolutely pivotal roles in protecting their siblings. Another big part of this, which I haven't mentioned and I should have put in earlier, part of the indoctrination, so we're talking about them going to school, a lot of the stuff of what they're learning is actually religious teachings from Anne herself. But another big part of it is also that there is this fear instilled in them from people outside and especially people in power like police. The kids are told that adults in the outside world just want to kill them, they want to murder them, they want to rape them, they shouldn't trust them. The only way that they can be safe is within this family. But they weren't safe within the family, but they didn't know what safe. If that's what safe meant for them, imagine what the idea of what would occur if they spoke to a police officer must have looked like in their head. There's one boy who talks about having this mental image of being put into a sack and being beat to death with a hammer if he ever came in contact with police. These 2 girls who got a little glimpse into the outside world, one of them actually eventually stood up to Anne. She'd made some friends and she brought one of them back into the home. And obviously the aunties and the aunt, that was just an absolute no-no, but she did it on purpose. She wanted to defy the rules that were set. And there was a very clear rule book. It had Anne's signature on it of the things that were to occur, and if it didn't work out that way, this is when the beatings would occur, or hands would be held in fires, or heads would be pushed underwater. So these 2, I think one sister just managed to escape, and the other one was a bit more rebellious in the way that she did it, and she wanted to push those boundaries. And so eventually she was told, get out. You're not part of our family. Just get out and die in a gutter. So she left, and she was lucky that she'd made a couple of friends through having her job, and she started talking to them about what was happening inside the home. And they slowly encouraged her to talk to some police officers, which you can imagine how scared she would have been to do that. She did eventually talk to them about what was happening, and she talked about the use of LSD and the drugs that they were using. That police report ended up on the desk of the drug squad because of the LSD that was involved. There had been raids previous to when the kids were actually rescued, where people had gone in and looked. And I think the police thought it was, because they're turning up and here's this little group of kids and there's a little schoolroom set up and there's, equations on the board and the kids are all well dressed and they're clean and they're talking to the children and they're saying, are you being fed? And they're saying, well, yes, we are. They didn't know that they weren't being fed enough. In those little kids' minds, they're saying to the CPS people that are coming in and doing welfare checks, yeah, we're getting food. I've got a bed to sleep in. It's got blankets and I go to school every day. So the police kind of were like, well, this is a child protection issue. It's not our thing. And child protection, what they had seen of it, it kind of looked like they were being taken care of. They would talk to adults in the community, and those adults, of course, are not going to say, oh, no, this is horrific. You need to help these kids. they're spitting the same shit that Raynor Johnson did. Because that's what some of them are conditioned to believe. Some of them knew what was going on there. And they hid it. And they're just as much at fault as what Anne-Hamilton Byrne is. After the kids escaped and they talked to the police and they kind of put this thing together, with the two sisters, they tried to stay in contact and they'd sneak back into the house of a night and try and gather information. I think they stole some pages out of the rule book that had Anne's signature on it, and they took things from the house they knew that the police could use as evidence. At the same time that this is happening, the kids in the house are being told, your sisters are gone, they're horrible, they're worldly, they don't belong to us anymore, don't trust them, don't listen to them. But the kids are seeing these sisters come in and out trying to gather this information for the police, and they're too scared to tell anyone. They're not going to tell the aunties because they'll get flogged. They're not talking to each other about it because if the auntie's over here, they'll get flogged. And they probably didn't know what to think either, because there would also be a distrust for these girls that are sneaking back in and out of the house. So early in the morning on August 16th, 1987, the police turned up at the Lake Eildon house with the two sisters in tow, heavily armed, and knocked on the door. Anne, of course, wasn't there. She wasn't a part of these kids' day-to-day existence. The aunties were doing the raising. Anne was only interested in swanning in every now and again, getting a few pictures taken, and then going on away. When you see the videos of her with these kids, or even her and Bill when they're overseas and they'd make videos to send back to the kids, and it's so, she's got a big sun hat on and a beautiful shirt and she's so pretty and she's frolicking around an English garden. Oh, Bill, you do love the children, don't you? Let's send a message to the children. And it's so, when you know what happened, you just want to punch your fist through the screen of the television. Like, it is so infuriating. It is all just for show. I keep coming back to that place where I think this is just for her own personal resume. These kids, this house, she's not interested in being loved by them. She wants to be adored. She wants them to fear her. She's not interested in a reciprocal relationship with these children. She just wants them to idolize her. And I wonder if that has a big part in her setting up the aunties to abuse the children. So when she does swan back in for the weekend picnic where she's going to get photos taken, is it so the children adore her? Are they so desperate for affection and acknowledgement and validation that she set this up so these kids live this completely deprived life, and she would just waltz in and they would clamor all over each other to be the first person to get her attention? We're never going to know. I wish that I could understand her motivations behind it. So going back to the kids being rescued, they turned up with a bus, heavily armed police, who chose not to go in uniform because the sisters had advised them that the children would be petrified. They knock on the door, they go in, the kids are taken out one by one. The two sisters go around and try and grab some familiar items because they know how hard it's going to be for these kids. So it might be a stuffed toy, it might be a pillow, it might be something that they know that they value. I think the family cat might have been taken as well. They grab these few things, they put all the kids on the bus, and then they drive away. They stop on the way back for a meal, and the kids eat a proper meal. But that was something that they'd never experienced before. Their bellies were full. The adults weren't hurting them. The police didn't put them in a bag and beat them to death with a hammer like they thought they might. I can't imagine what it must have been like for them sitting on that bus thinking, what the hell is coming next? So the kids were taken to, it was a processing centre for a Lambie, I think, close to Melbourne. They made statements, the ones who are old enough to be able to do it. The police gathered all of that information. Protective Services was obviously involved. The task then come of how do we find out who these kids are? They don't even know their natural names. 14 of them have the Hamilton Byrne surname. They've grown up thinking that Anne and Bill are their mum and dad. So the process has to start of figuring out who these kids are, who their natural parents are. And luckily, the police were able to do that in a fairly timely fashion, because I think to get adoption papers or something at the time, it was about a 6-year process. There was a task force set up that had been given a little bit of funding. So they were able to use those funds to assist in gaining this information so these kids could start rebuilding their lives. But even the process of deprogramming them, that in itself would have been massive and taken quite possibly years of psychological
Forever.
support.
So where did the children go?
So they were taken to the Lambie Processing Centre.
And then back to their birth parents?
No, a lot of them didn't go back to their birth parents. So some of the kids found out that their biological parents were actually sect members, including some of the aunties, which would have been a whole pile of trauma on top of what they'd already experienced. Some children went into care. Some of the children were old enough by this stage that they could live in group homes or head out on their own and forge a life for themselves. Some were adopted by other families. I really feel for the people who found out that their families were still in that cult, because there would have been a sense of wanting to return and wanting to build relationships. For some, it was horrific, because when they found out that the people who were the ones handing out abuse were the people who actually gave birth to them, that's a whole other layer of stuff that you've got to work through. Some never reconnected. Some did reconnect. Some had relationships into adulthood with the people who were sect members. I wouldn't say they were exceptionally functional relationships, but they did exist.
And what are your feelings towards the aunties knowing everything that you know?
I don't know how you can put your child in a position and watch that occur to them.
Be the hand that does that to them.
Yeah. I can't comprehend that. They are victims themselves. I'm happy to acknowledge that.
Are these the people that you were talking about in the last episode?
That got sucked into it. But then you have a choice. It doesn't matter what has occurred to you. At every point you have a choice. And I think this is why I said in the intro to this episode that those people who are cycle breakers are my gurus, because when you look at stuff like this and then you see people who are the exact opposite of what the aunties are, who are victims of a certain kind of abuse, and then go out into the world and turn that around through persistence and resilience and doing the goddamn work, and turn that around and create fulfilling, meaningful lives where they are not repeating these traumas over again and causing harm to other humans. I have so much respect for people who can do this in the world. It is not easy. It is fucking hard work when you are someone who has experienced significant trauma and you manage to turn that around and live as a survivor, not as a victim. So much respect for these guys. I can't put the aunties in the same basket as them. Prior to the police raids, there had been information filtering out about this family and what was going on. But no, it didn't really fall to anyone. People knew about it, but no one kind of took responsibility for doing anything. So once the task force was put together, and they called it Task Force Forest, there was money. There were people who were then allowed to dedicate their time to finding out what had gone on here and cleaning up the process. Those police did a great job, and they absolutely 100% deserve acknowledgement. Their involvement in this, some of them, has caused them lifelong effects as well.
Yeah, it's understandable.
There was a journalist that worked for, I think, a Current Affair, and she had been following this story a lot, and she'd headed to Hawaii. And you know how on a Current Affair they do those, like where they catch a criminal as they're getting out of their car, walking into their home, and ask them the real hard questions. She did that to Anne-Hamilton Byrne in Hawaii when they were just there on a holiday or something. Like this woman was after her, and she worked with the police and with the kids. And what has formed is this really incredible relationship where this journalist and this one particular police officer have been instrumental in the support networks of these kids as they've moved through what came next and then into their adult lives. So they're worth mentioning, but if it's something that you want to know more about, I'm going to give you the documentary where you can learn all about the role that these people played. They tried to track Anne down. It was a really hard job. There is obviously laws around statute of limitations on crimes, and because by the time the kids come out, some of these crimes were then regarded as historical, it was very hard for the police to compile a brief of evidence that would be able to convict Anne of anything, because Anne was not the person administering the drugs on a daily basis, because she was not the one depriving him of the food, because the abuse happened at the hands of so many adults, and there was no adults that were willing to come forward and speak on behalf of these children. The police made a decision that they would then try and have Anne extradited to Australia based on the fraudulent paperwork that her and her lawyer had put together to acquire some of these kids. So ultimately, Anne never faced any jail time for her crimes. Her and Bill were both charged. I think they both pled guilty to perjury and were both fined $5,000 each. And when you look at her wealth, which I think at the time of her death amounted to about $50 million, $5,000 for her wasn't much. She did have to say she was guilty, but it was only of forging documents, which is not really an outcome for the victims in this scenario. The police chose not to in this case, and I find this so admirable, to try and chase down a criminal conviction that was solely reliant on the personal testimonies of the kids, because that would mean that those children would have to get on a stand in a court of law and be cross-examined by very likely a QC that Anne would hire because she had the funds to do it. It could possibly be a QC that is a sect member. And the police had really, really strong feelings about not exposing these kids to any further trauma than that they had already experienced. And for anyone who has gone through the criminal courts in an abuse trial or a sexual assault trial knows just how massive of an impact that has on victims. So I really, really respect the police in this case for making that choice. So Anne and Bill were charged $5,000 each. They went on to live their lives. Anne continued to talk about perhaps maybe adopting more children after these ones had been taken away from her. She didn't, thankfully. So it was 1993 when she was arrested and brought back to Australia, which was a fair amount of time, considering the amount of time between August 1987 when the kids were removed. So the police worked on this. significantly to try and put something together. But she went on to live a life. She still had followers. Even after the court case, people were still completely aligned with her teachings and her way of thinking, right up until her death, which occurred on the 13th of June 2019. So right till the end of her life, she sat in a room on her own, surrounded by photos of children who she never really knew and never really loved. And that was all she had left to hang on to, was these picture perfect images of a life that she orchestrated and maybe a few visitors from time to time. I know there were sect members who were still devoted to her at her death. I don't know what happened to her fortune. I know that 2 of the kids eventually went down the civil avenue and did sue her for damages. They were both awarded a small amount of money in the grand scheme of her exceptional wealth. But she never answered for what she did. I feel like that in itself is amongst the greatest of her crimes, is that she just got away with the whole thing. While there are these incredible, resilient humans who are out there forging a life for themselves despite everything that they experienced. I really wanted to just kind of focus on the kids and what their life was like, because it was extraordinary. What they survived was extraordinary. These people are cycle breakers. So much respect.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of If These Trees Could Talk. If you would like to access more about the places or information included in today's topic, please visit our website, ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. If you would like to follow us on our adventures, check us out on Facebook or Insta. Our creative writer is Shannon Walters, and our podcast is produced at Bellevue Studio in the Hunter Valley with audio production by Megan Anderson. We love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review, and if you would like to hear more, please subscribe. We look forward to you joining us for our next adventure.